This is a very informative paper on COVID's potential to be a superantigen, where superantigens are potent antigens that can send the immune system into overdrive. So what is a superantigen? A superantigen was coined in 1989 and defined proteins that hyperstimulate T cells via the cross-linking of T cell receptors with MHC class II molecules, where reactions between superantigens and T cells may lead to a number of outcomes, including energy, inflammation, cytotoxicity, deletion of T cells, and autoimmunity, where energy is a lack of reaction by the body's defense mechanism to foreign substances, and cytotoxicity is the degree to which a substance can cause damage to a cell. Superantigens have also been shown to impair post-vaccination memory cell responses to unrelated antigens, and they also antagonize memory cell activation. Superantigens have also been shown to impact central nervous system function and are implicated in the development of neurological conditions. Now, in addition to superantigens, there's superantigen-like proteins that activate lymphocytes using mechanisms that place them outside the superantigen classification. And these superantigen-like proteins have been implicated in inducing thrombotic and bleeding complications through platelet activation, which is something that we see a lot with COVID. Now let's talk about superantigens and T cell dysfunction. So superantigens can deplete thymocytes or immature T cells, but can hyperstimulate mature antigen-experienced CD4 and CD8 T cells, where after this hyperstimulation by the superantigen, T cells can enter a state of unresponsiveness known as anergy, where they fail to respond and may sometimes subsequently enter apoptosis or programmed cell death. So some examples of superantigens include rabies and Staphylococcus enterotoxin B. Superantigen-like examples include Staphylococcus aureus paralogs, and superantigen triggers are like dengue virus or Epstein-Barr virus, which can be reactivated by the superantigen. And recall, Epstein-Barr virus is reactivated with COVID infection quite frequently. So superantigens will directly activate the immune response. This is also the case for superantigen-like, while the superantigen trigger will transactivate latent superantigens like Epstein-Barr. And the resulting clinical outcomes can include neurological issues such as dementia, encephalitis, hormone stimulation, modified behavior, and neophobia, which is the fear of new things. Immunologic complications can include cytokine storms, lymphocyte differentiation, lymphocyte apoptosis, anergy, and autoimmunity. And cardiovascular outcomes can include platelet activation, thrombosis, endothelial-mediated vascular damage. And what's interesting is that we're seeing all of these things in the literature with COVID, and specifically long COVID. What's pretty interesting is that T cell death elicited by superantigenic stimulation is most apparent among T cells activated by the bystander effect, which is when the immune system responds with T cell activation without antigen recognition. So it's just a generalized immune response instead of a specific one, which can then resultantly trigger autoimmune diseases, which warrants investigation because there's a possibility of deletion of antiviral memory due to this bystander effect, which would then make you more susceptible to other infections or to previous infections of like COVID. And these superantigens also cause naive T cell depletion, where new naive T cells are not being readily generated due to thymic involution, which involves the shrinking of the thymus with age, typically, but we've also seen that COVID directly shrinks the thymus. This has been shown in a lot of our brain scan literature. Now that we better understand superantigens, let's relate this back to COVID. So this study looked at COVID in mild to moderate infection, which found that there was depletion of naive T and B cells in individuals with long COVID. And another paper even found that there were higher levels of apoptotic T cells in COVID infection than there were in people with HIV, where these findings, in addition to the presentation of multi-inflammatory syndrome in children, seem to suggest that COVID is in fact superantigen, or that COVID is superantigen-like. But not only is there the multi-inflammatory syndrome in children, there's also multi-inflammatory syndrome in adults. So we can be pretty confident that COVID is causing superantigen or superantigen-like clinical presentations and biomarkers. And alarmingly, the approach of our countries are that they're willing to tolerate high levels of infection provided that the healthcare system can cope, and this approach is predicated on the belief that a level of protective population immunity or herd immunity can be achieved and sustained, and that over time the impact of reinfection will be less severe. However, this is likely to be a grave error, as the effect of a superantigen is dependent on dose exposure, genetic predisposition, environmental conditions, and immune response, meaning that the more times this is reintroduced to your body, the higher instance that it will develop in these long-term negative effects, which will definitely result in overwhelming the hospital system. Additionally, there's the issue of long COVID, where we've seen the odds of this increase with each subsequent infection, and the very existence of this condition may be a warning, that canary in the coal mine, of this superantigenic effect, where urgent research is needed to confirm or refute the superantigenic nature of COVID to better understand the long-term risks being taken by government whose policies enable widespread transmission, and to understand whether it is necessary to maintain consistently high levels of neutralizing antibodies to better protect against the consequences of exposure to the pathogen, which is a fancy way of saying if we are going to continue down this road where we're letting COVID run wild, where we're allowing people to get reinfected again and again over time, we need to be 100% sure if COVID is a superantigen or not. Everything sort of hinges on this question and the answer to this question, and as we learn more and more about COVID and the effects of COVID and long COVID, it seems that governments around the world have made a grave mistake.